Assalamu alaikum. Can everyone hear this? Sorry for the delay. There was some technical difficulties setting up the mic and things like that. Let me mute my phone. Can everyone? All right. Let me see. Trying to get the thing back. Okay. I got a new audio mic, so I'm not sure if it's picking up correctly. If you can't hear me, just leave a comment. Or maybe if it's too loud, maybe. Okay. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Okay. So Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, Salatu Wassalam ala Rasulillah. I want to talk about this new show that I'm trying to do, live show every week. Inshallah, I'm not sure about the timing, but for now it's going to be in the evenings in the US. I might move it earlier if it's, I know it's too late for the UK and some other parts of the world, and it's also too late for some people in the US. So inshallah, I plan to maybe reschedule it depending on what works better for people. I also wanted to go over what the format of the show is. For now, I'm going to be talking to you guys, answering questions that you might have. You can leave a comment, any issue that you want to discuss. I'm happy to cover it. I want to base the format of the show on addressing a lot of the articles that I've been publishing on muslimskeptic.com and going over some of the things that I've been talking about on the site itself, do analysis, talk about current events that are relevant to Muslims, and then also in the future, inshallah, I plan to invite guests and have discussions and back and forth and talk about some issues of that nature, inshallah. Right, so, bro, you take so long to respond to my messages. I'm sorry about that. I try my best to respond to messages that people send me, but sometimes I get held up with a lot of other work. But, so let me start off. I want to address one issue that came up. A lot of people sent me a post where there was a person that I don't want to name who wrote about this issue of LGBT and respecting LGBT and so forth. And so this is something that I wanted to address and analyze. I want to go through the post and analyze step by step what's wrong, because some people have trouble recognizing what's wrong with a post that's referring to this specific issue. And hopefully through this show and through your questions, we can analyze actual posts, and you can see kind of my thought process when I analyze things like that. But before we actually get into that post, I just want to read some ayat from the Quran that are relevant to the question of LGBT, the question of how our orientation should be in thinking about same-sex behavior, same-sex relationships, and so forth. So it's always good to remind ourselves about these ayat, especially when it comes to same-sex behavior, because it's mentioned so often in the Quran. Qawm Lut, the people of Lut alayhi salam, are mentioned in over 8 different surah of the Quran. So it's good to remind ourselves of these ayat. So, Bismillah. A'udhu billahi minash shaytanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ بل بل أنتم قوم تجهلون فما كان جواب قومه إلا أن قالوا أخرجوا آل لوط من قريتكم إنهم أناس يتطهرون فأنجيناه وأهله إلا امرأته قدرناها من الغابرين وأمطرنا عليهم مطرا فساء مطر المنذرين قل الحمد لله وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى الله خير أما يشركون صدق الله العظيم. So let me read the translation of this. This is from Surah An-Naml. And mention Lut, when he said to his people, do you commit fahisha, immorality, while you see? Do you indeed approach men with desire instead of women? Do you indeed approach men with desire instead of women? You are people behaving ignorantly. But the answer of his people was nothing except that they said, expel the family of Lut from your city. Indeed, they are people who keep themselves pure. So this was the response of Qawm Lut. Expel the family of Lut from your city, and because there are people who keep themselves pure from this kind of shahwa. So we saved him and his family except for his wife. We destined her to be of those who remained behind, and we rained upon them a rain, meaning a rain of stones, and evil was the rain of those who were warned. So say, praise be to Allah, and peace be upon his servants whom he has chosen. Is Allah better, or what they associate with him? So this is what Allah says in one place about Qawm Lut, their reaction, their response to the command of their Lord and the message of Lut alayhi, that this is fahisha, that you're committing a grave crime to approach men, for men to approach men with shahwa, with desire, instead of women. And so they disobeyed, they rejected this very brazenly, very arrogantly. And so the result of that, Allah is telling us what was the consequence of that, and it was a very grave consequence. So now let's look at a post that we want to analyze now. So bear with me, I'm just trying to figure some of these controls out. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Let me make it larger. Okay, so this is from, I don't want to mention who it is, but this is someone who presents themselves as a traditional religious leader, someone who teaches religion. And this is what they had to say. The conversation around homosexuality and the LGBTQ community in general always seems to make conservatives, Muslim or otherwise, uneasy and uncomfortable. I think that's usually because the focus is on sexuality, sexual behavior, etc., which in general is something that most people aren't comfortable talking about openly with anyone other than their partner, but especially religious folk who have strict standards of propriety and tend to shy away from such topics. I think when we shift our focus away from sexuality and defining what is and isn't appropriate, acceptable, etc., to basic respect and who does/doesn't deserve it, it's a lot easier to have dialogue around the topic. Okay, so that's fine. For example, living in a free society where every individual has the right to do whatever they please or think/believe in however or whatever they want, so long as they do not harm others, is something that's widely understood and generally accepted. Okay, so think about what that means. So from the religious or conservative person's perspective, there should be no conflict with saying that people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community deserve to be respected and treated as fellow citizens and human beings, even though we disagree with them. Likewise, for people who are from the LGBTQ community, there should be no conflict with saying that people who are religious or conservative deserve to be respected and treated as fellow citizens and human beings, even though we disagree with them. Are debates about what is or isn't acceptable or sinful really necessary? Each group clearly has their own beliefs and don't agree. So what's the point of arguing? Should either group be shamed, ridiculed, mocked, or ostracized for their beliefs? If you're willing to risk the safety, dignity, and basic respect of any other human being, then what makes you so deserving? Should either group be branded as intolerant, hostile, or insensitive to the other because they don't share the other's views? If you think you're right and others who don't share your beliefs are wrong, that's your prerogative. What you don't have a right to do is force your beliefs onto others. It works both ways. We need to stop polarizing this issue and forcing people to take a definitive stand where they either accept it and embrace it wholeheartedly or reject it and hate it wholeheartedly. It's perfectly possible to accept or reject something or even someone in your heart, but practice mutual respect and tolerance. This is, for Muslims anyway, a defining principle of our faith. Let people be. Let them do as they will. Never force your beliefs on anyone. Focus on yourself, spread peace, and treat all of God's creation with respect. And then ended with a dua. May God make us people of respect and wisdom. May we think independently and never capitulate to anyone else's standards but God's. And may we be cautious of those who try to force us to compromise our beliefs as a trade-off of being accepted by them. Ameen. Okay, so let's analyze this. Let's analyze this, the relevant paragraphs. But first, I mean, what do you guys think? Like, do you think that this this makes sense? Like, does this sound good to you? Let me read what some of you guys are saying. Yeah, so Brother Zuzu here is saying, don't force your beliefs on others. Is a belief forced on others? Okay, that's good. What else? Okay, so let's talk about this. Okay, here's where the problem starts. For example, living in a free society where every individual has the right to do whatever they please or think, believe in however or whatever they want, so long as they do not harm others, is something that's widely understood and generally accepted. Okay, so just because one lives in a free society, what does this mean? Well, free society, that's a big can of worms. But let's look at this idea of every individual has the right to do whatever they please. The thing is that, what does this mean? Does this mean in the absolute sense, every individual has the right to do as they please? Or do you mean it in a legal sense? Okay, given a specific context, do people have the right to do X, Y, or Z? Okay, that's important because it's not true that everyone has the right to do whatever they please in the absolute sense. In the absolute sense, our rights are defined by what Allah has commanded and what Allah has deemed correct and within human interests and within what is correct to do. So that's what a right is. Okay, you can't just define rights and say, well, I have the right to, drink alcohol, for example. If you're a Muslim, that's not something that's your right in the absolute sense. You don't have a right to do certain things that violate what Allah has commanded. Okay, so but if you mean right in the legal sense, yes. So in the United States, in many European countries, you do have the right to drink legally. Okay, that's one of the rights that are given to people, for example, or the right to many other things. But we shouldn't conflate, or we shouldn't confuse rights in the legal sense versus rights in the absolute sense. If you phrase it in this kind of ambiguous way, such as in this post, then people can get confused. Muslims can get confused and think, well, everyone has the right to live however they want. Everyone has the right for in terms of their behavior, if they want to practice same-sex behavior, if they want to practice zina, if they want to drink alcohol, if they want to gamble, if they want to do the kinds of behaviors that have been prohibited by Allah, have been prohibited by the sacred law, that's their right. Okay? And if you start having this mentality, then you're going to start thinking that, well, Allah was unjust, or Allah is unjust in constraining people's quote-unquote right to behave in certain ways, to do certain actions, to speak in certain ways. Okay? Another example is, does everyone have a right to worship whoever they want or whatever they want? Do people have the right for this? The answer is no. Not in the absolute sense. Not in the absolute sense. In the legal sense, in certain countries, yeah, there is certain leeway that people are given to worship and to be a part of different religious communities and so forth. Those are legal rights in context of a state and so forth, but not in the absolute sense. In the absolute sense, we know that this is not a person's right to worship idols or to engage in idolatry and so forth. So we have to make sure to understand this distinction between rights in the legal sense versus rights in the absolute sense. Also, so that's one issue. The other issue is every individual has the right to do whatever they please as long as they do not harm others. Well, this is just pure harm principle. This is pure liberalism. Liberalism in the philosophical sense. This is what liberals will say. This is what liberal philosophy will say. Everything is permissible. Everything is morally fine as long as you do not harm others, as long as you are not causing harm. But this is silly. There are many things that people are restricted from doing that have nothing to do with harm. And furthermore, who gets to decide what is or is not harmful? Who gets to decide what is or is not harmful? Because ultimately harm can depend on what kind of position that you have on certain issues. So, for example, in Islam, we know that engaging in zina, engaging in fornication, sex outside of marriage, this is something that is harmful. This is something that causes deep harm in and of itself. Okay, and this is something that also has many harmful consequences. And someone who has not accepted that truth is going to have is going to say, well, I don't think that that's harmful. Okay, so then why should you restrict my ability to engage in this kind of practice? So the Muslim can concede the harm principle. We can say, yes, fine, everything is permissible except that which causes harm. But zina is something that is very harmful. Therefore, we need to restrict it. Therefore, we need to have laws. We need to have hudud. We need to have social sanctions. We need to have all the kinds of things that will restrict people and prevent them from engaging in this type of behavior. Same thing when it comes to same-sex behavior. Same-sex behavior is something extremely, extremely detrimental, something extremely harmful to people, to society, to families. Okay, and this is what Lut alayhi salam was saying in the ayat that we just read, that you're approaching men with shahwa, and shahwa is something that if it is engaged in and allowed to be fed into in an unbridled way, then this is something that is very harmful to the human being. Okay? It's harmful to the human being when desires are just indulgent, this hedonistic kind of indulgence of desire. And that's why Allah describes Qawm Lut as musrifun, those engaged in israf. They go beyond the bounds. Okay, shahwa, if you are engaged in shahwa, or you are feeding into shahwa, there are certain limits that Allah has defined, hudud, that Allah has defined for that kind of shahwa. If you go beyond that, if you go beyond the limits that Allah has set, then this is something very destructive. It's something that will pull you down. And this is something that, even within secular studies and secular thought is recognized, that you can be taken over by your desires, and desires can be an addiction. One example that is now considered an epidemic is addiction to pornography. Addiction to pornography, where the shahwa has been engaged in. People have this access to pornography, and then by consuming it, it becomes an addiction. It starts taking over a person, and they have to, seek therapy for that. They have to. This becomes a problem where they're being fired from their jobs, or they're failing studies in school because they just have to have it. Okay, this is a kind of addiction that's taking people, debasing people, and lowering their state. And there's the spiritual aspect. There's the mental aspect. There is the entire person. Okay, is affected by this kind of unbridled lust and engagement in shahwa beyond the limits. Okay, beyond the limits. So there are many harms to that within society. If people are engaged in that kind of behavior, that not only affects you, it affects your family. Okay, it not only affects you, it affects your family. It affects your neighbors. It affects all of society when people are engaged in this kind of. And when this kind of behavior is normalized, and now we're living in a time where it's actually celebrated. People are celebrating these kinds of behaviors. So this is this is majorly harmful. And so even we can accept the harm principle. We can just concede that point. We'll say, okay, fine. Our morality is based purely on what is or is not harmful. Fine, we'll concede that point. Well, then this is something that is harmful. This is something that is objectively, truly harmful and destructive to human beings, to families, and to society as a whole. Okay, so this is something that we have to understand. If we don't understand it, then it's going to, first of all, it makes our revelation, it makes the Quran seem incomprehensible. It makes the actions of Allah seem incomprehensible. Why would Allah have such a severe consequence for these people? Why would Allah, and this is found in the Bible as well, this account is narrated within the Bible as well, of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, and Qawm Lut, why would Allah have such a severe consequence if this is just a harmless act? Right? So this is something that we have to reflect on. We have to look at what Allah says about these things and not think that, this is just stories from the past. Stories from the past that has no relevance to us. And no, it has a relevance. This is why, and this is something that we need to understand and recognize. Okay, so let's go to the next paragraph. So from the religious or conservative person's perspective, there should be no conflict with saying that people who identify as part of this LGBTQ community deserve to be respected and treated as fellow citizens and human beings, even though we disagree with them. Okay, so first of all, why do we have to acknowledge a community? Okay, this is a self-defined. Okay, you can categorize people. People can self-categorize in many different ways. That doesn't mean you acknowledge those categories, especially when the category is based on something that you fundamentally disagree with, right? So the LGBTQ community, this community, how are you defining community based on sexual preferences, sexual behavior? Is there a community of adulterers? People who like to cheat on their spouse secretly, like adultery. Is there a community of adulterers? Should we have respect for the adulterous community, for example? Adultery is also, something that is between two consensual adults, two consenting adults who agree to engage in this kind of behavior of adultery. So should we respect them? Why should we, why are we categorizing people in a certain way? You can also look at white nationalists. This is another community that they consider themselves to be a cohesive group, and they have certain ideas about preserving the white race and so forth, highly racist views. So they're a community. Should we respect them as a community? Why? Why or why not? So this idea that we have to respect a certain group just because, I don't see the logic of that. I don't see the motivation for that. It's a group that we've acknowledged, this is very destructive. This is very evil kind of behavior that's very destructive. And this was acknowledged, this was understood for the vast majority of human history, only until the last, even within the Western world. I would say only in the past 5 to 10 years has these ideas come about, that, we have an LGBT community and we have to respect them, we have to keep them, we have to celebrate them for who they are, and they have this identity. This is something very, very recent. Okay? And why should the whole world has to change its understanding and its morality, some of our deepest commitments about what's right and wrong. We have to all throw that in the trash. We have to all get rid of that. Because suddenly, this has become the political dogma. This has all suddenly become something that we all have to accept. And no one can ever express any kind of disagreement or any kind of trepidation or hesitation about this kind of behavior or this kind of quote-unquote identity, this kind of community. No, no, we don't have to accept that. We should not accept that. We should not accept that kind of imposition and coercion, especially when it's imposition and coercion that goes against Islam, that goes against our sacred law, that goes against the Quran, goes against the Sunnah. So this is something that we have to understand, and no Muslim should ever say, we have to respect the LGBT community. No, that's not this post that we're looking at is just taking it for granted that would be the case. But it's quite silly and harmful. But as far as treating people as human beings, we treat people as human beings within Islamic law, within the Sharia, and within Islamic morality. Generally, we treat people as human beings, regardless. Okay, that's fine. That doesn't mean that we respect them for certain behaviors. Okay, for example, someone who is engaged in this kind of behavior, in this same-sex behavior, I can acknowledge that they're a human being. Yes, they're a human being, but I'm not going to identify them by their sexual behavior. I'm not going to identify, you're my LGBT brother or sister or whatever. Okay, I don't have to acknowledge those categories. Why? Okay, just like I wouldn't say, you're my adulterous brother, or you're my alcohol drinking brother, you're my gambling brother. No, we don't have to define people by their actions, especially when it's a negative action, when it's something that is this kind of fahisha, this kind of very lewd, wrong behavior. We don't need to identify people by that. We shouldn't identify people by that, but we can identify them as human beings. Okay, we have to use the category. See, this is the thing. We have to bring our mindset in line with the categories that Allah has given us. Allah has given us categories to categorize people, and this is what is mentioned in the Quran. Categories are mentioned in the Quran, or categories are mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. Like, for example, Muslimun, Mu'minun, Kuffar, Ahlul Kitab. Okay, these are just some of the many categories that Allah gives us. Okay, but these other categories that are new, they're products of the human mind, or products of politics, or products of popular culture. No, we don't have to limit ourselves to these kinds of, or we don't have to acknowledge these kinds of categories. Okay, so yes, as human beings, everyone should be treated as a human being. Everyone has huquq, rights as human beings. Okay, but that's not that's something separate than saying that, I respect people who are LGBT. Okay, let me look at some questions. Okay, Eclair says, do we really live in a free society where every individual has the right to do whatever they please? Of course not. Exactly. We don't live in such a society. Many things are illegal. Right? Many things are illegal. The law prevents people from acting in a million different ways. Right? Everything from traffic laws to tax laws to property law, real estate law, all of these laws. There's so many laws on the books, okay, that prevent people from acting in the ways that they please. A person might not, some of these libertarians, they don't want to pay taxes. They're forced to. They're forced to pay taxes by force of law. So this idea that, we live in a free society where every individual has the right to do whatever they please is kind of a caricature. It has nothing to do with reality. Let's see. Okay, we talked about some of these. We talked about the harms of same-sex behavior earlier. This is something really that Muslims have to understand, because the claim is often made that, this is something harmless. This is just harmless behavior between two or more consenting adults, and therefore, why should we prohibit it? But as I mentioned, there's deep harms. We shouldn't internalize this idea that men having sex with men has no harms. It has numerous harms that I mentioned earlier. Another one that I didn't mention is twisting and confusing and conflating gender roles and the existence of male and female. Okay, this is something that's very important. Allah says He's created us male and female, and the female is not like the male. So this is something that so much of morality is based on within Islam, is that there are gender roles, that there's a role for men and there's a role for women, and that encompasses not only sexual behavior, it encompasses family, it encompasses marriage, it encompasses all of society. These specific roles that come to us in the sacred law. So why is the sacred law gendered in this way? Why are there gender roles? Okay. The answer is that this is how Allah has created us, and He knows what is the best thing for us so that we can flourish as a society, flourish as a community, flourish as a family, flourish as husband and wife, right? This is called guidance. This is called hidayah. Okay. Without guidance, we're lost. And so Allah is the one who has created us and has told us what is the optimal way to live our lives. And as Muslims, we have to have full confidence, full conviction in this. And we have to be keen on understanding and internalizing and feeling inside of us, feeling this kind of conviction. And even if in areas where we don't understand the wisdom, the hikmah of the Sharia, of the sacred law, then we have to strive for that. We have to strive for understanding that we have to, but we always have husn dhan. We always have husn dhan of Allah, that what Allah has prescribed is indeed the best, is indeed the peak of morality, the peak of rationality, the peak of human flourishing and living in this life. Okay, in this life. Okay, so this kind of, some people have the idea that, Allah has the Sharia is just hoops, Allah is just making us jump through hoops. There's no real benefit towards, avoiding zina. There's no real benefit to avoiding drinking. There's no real benefit to paying zakat. There's no real benefit. These are just arbitrary hoops that we have to jump through. Okay, these are arbitrary hoops that we have to jump through, and there's no actual benefit that we obtain from those. And I'm not getting into the kalam debate on this, right? Because that's a separate issue. If you know what I'm referring to, the kalam debate between the Asharis, the Maturidis, the Atharis, is there, what is the divine? Does everything that Allah prescribe within the Sharia, does that have a rational purpose or a practical end? So that's a separate discussion. That is a separate discussion, regardless of what position you take within the schools of Kalam on this issue. It's still the case that there is a benefit in this life and the next. Okay, all the scholars acknowledge that there's a benefit that you get from living according to the Sharia, by living according to what your Creator has told you to live by. Okay, so going back to what I was mentioning, the same-sex behavior twists and conflates and distorts gender roles. And this is one of the many harms that it inflicts on society. And so it's no coincidence, it's no accident that transgenderism is something that is really blowing up, that's becoming a really big issue. Because it's because of LGBT. Okay, T is the transgenderism. Because once you start getting people to think that, okay, well, now I'm attracted to the same sex, well, maybe I'm not a man, or maybe I'm not an actual woman, maybe I'm not male, maybe I'm not female. So this is something that creates so much confusion and destroys a person's psychology. This is coming partly from same-sex behavior and the normalization of same-sex relationships and so forth. So this is one of the many harms that we have to keep in mind and keep focusing, so that we don't fall into this nonsense that, this is a harmless behavior. Okay. Yeah, let me finish this post and then I'll switch back to full screen. Okay. Are debates about what is or isn't acceptable or sinful really necessary? Yeah, it is necessary, right? It is necessary to talk about what is sinful, like amongst Muslims and amongst in the larger context. Like what I'm telling you right now about the harms of same-sex behavior, I will say the same thing. We should say the same thing to non-Muslims. Okay, and we do this it's part of calling people to Islam. It's part of calling people to Islam, because Islam is the better way. Islam is salvation in this life and the next life. So if we truly do care about people, we care about their well-being, then we should call them to what is better for them. Call them away from harm. Right? So Lut alayhi salam, the Prophet, what was his whole mission? Like, what was the whole point of telling his people that don't commit this kind of behavior, don't behave in this kind of way? What was the point of that? Of course it's necessary. Of course it's necessary to talk about what's sinful and what's harmful. This is our responsibility. Okay? This is our responsibility as Muslims in the world. This is part of da'wah. We have to enjoin good and forbid evil. Right? We have to enjoin good and forbid evil, and this is part of what it means to be a believer. And we have plenty of opportunity to do that. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Should either group be shamed, ridiculed, mocked, or ostracized for their beliefs? Well, this is conflating a lot of things, but if I say that, well, same-sex behavior is shameful, that's shaming people? Okay, was Lut alayhi salam shaming his people by telling them that they're doing something wrong? Okay, and don't do this? Was he shaming them for their beliefs? Okay, was he like, is that risking the safety and the dignity of his people, right? If you're willing to see, this is why the post is so confused. Like it's just amazing that someone could, like a Muslim who considers themselves to be a teacher, or is considering himself to be a religious figure, is saying this kind of nonsense. Okay. We need to stop polarizing this issue and forcing people to take a definitive stand where they either accept it and embrace it wholeheartedly or reject it and hate it wholeheartedly. Yeah, well, it is a polarizing issue. You either are fine with it or you're not. So that's polarizing. Okay. Again, like, that's why we ground ourselves in the narrative of the Quran when Allah is telling us about Qawm Lut. Like, was Lut alayhi being polarizing? Na'udhu billah, right? Because he told them that this is fahisha and that this is going to lead to destruction. Okay, so this is that post. هذا هو. So let's answer some questions. So Shibli Rahman, Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. He says, does the possibility of a person's sexual orientation being determined by genetics having any bearing on discussions pertaining to its morality? No, of course not. Right? So someone, this question of is sexual orientation, is it genetic, or is it nature, or is it nurture? Are people born that way, or are they basically how they were raised make them into desiring the same sex or not? So this question of nature versus nurture, it has no bearing to the moral question of the issue. Right? And I'll tell you why. There are many things that you can say could possibly have a genetic basis. Some geneticists have claimed that being more promiscuous has a genetic basis, or it's natural. You're born, some people are just born more promiscuous. Does that mean that they have license to commit zina? Because they're just naturally born to have more desires, have more shahwa. So then is there kind of an exception in the sacred law that allows them to engage in that heightened shahwa, those desires? No, of course not. Right? And many other behaviors, not just, some people might claim that kleptomaniacs, those who have this kind of obsessive need to steal things, kleptomania, it's actually a psychological disorder. It could be, Allahu Alam, it could be something that a person is born with. Does that mean we should lower our expectations when it comes to stealing for these people because they're suffering? So it's true that Allah is Ar-Rahman, and Allah is all just, right? And He will be able to judge people in the day of judgment according to the different kinds of tests and challenges that they have. If some person is more inclined to a certain thing, then maybe perhaps Allah in His mercy, He will lessen the judgment of that person, or the punishment, or forgive that person for engaging in something that they're more inclined to do, but there is more difficult for them to resist certain kinds of behaviors, because that was a test that Allah has specifically given that person. So that's fine, but that's something separate. That's something that is not relevant to the application of the law, or that's not relevant to the application of morality and ethics, whether it be secular ethics or it be Islamic ethics. So no. And on the issue of whether same-sex behavior is nature versus nurture, can it be genetic? Allahu Alam. I think maybe it's possible that Allah has created people who may have a tendency to be attracted to the same sex in a sexual way. I don't know. Allahu alam. There's ayah. Allah mentions that that Lut has said that, you're committing an action. Lut is talking to his people, like, you're committing action that no one before you has ever done. So some will point to, well, maybe this ayah is saying that if it's true that, if Lut's people, Qawm Lut, are the first ones who are engaging in this behavior, then it can't be genetic. It can't be something that humans could possibly have been created to engage in that kind of behavior. But some of the tafasir of this ayah mentioned that it could be referring to the fact that Qawm Lut were doing it openly. They were openly engaged in this kind of behavior, shamelessly engaged in it. Whereas in the past, other people, they might have had certain people who had that desire or maybe even engaged in it, but they weren't openly doing it. They weren't like calling for it in the way that Qawm Lut was doing so. So, Allahu alam. I'm not sure. I haven't seen anything definitive to say from Islamic sources on whether this can be considered nature versus nurture. And there's a lot of studies that say that there can be a lot of environmental factors that influence. Like, they've done twin studies where they take two twins and they see as adults, one of them turns out same-sex attracted to the same sex, and the other twin is not. And they look at, well, does this have to do with any kind of sexual abuse that the child might have suffered that has caused them, that might create or elicit this kind of same-sex tendency, same-sex desire tendency, or could it be the lack of strong male influence in a child's life? There have been some studies who say that it seems like there's a correlation between same-sex attraction later in life and the lack of strong paternal figure in a child's life. So these are all studies. There's nothing definitive, and regardless if it turns out that it's nature and it is something that could be genetic, that doesn't affect the morality of the issue. It doesn't have any effect on the Sharia and what is permissible within the sacred law. Okay, a lot of questions here. Hudhaifa asks, what do you think about Muslim politicians who say they support LGBT rights? Okay, so this is a perfect transition for an article. So let me pull it up, because I wrote just last week on such politicians, and there was kind of a very bizarre case. Okay. So this was news that came out on our two Muslimah congresswomen, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and the Supreme Court made a decision to uphold President Trump's ban on transgender servicemen. You can't be transgendered and serve in the military. And so Ilhan came out with a series of tweets and statements saying that this is terrible. How dare Donald Trump do this, or how dare the Supreme Court. Here she is. It is a sad day for our country as individual one's attack on transgender Americans serving in our military is upheld by a far-right Supreme Court. We see you, we hear you, we will defeat this ban. Okay. So it's very bizarre that why she would come out with such a strong statement opposing the Supreme Court on their decision on this. Like, it should be clear Islamically what our ethics are regarding this issue. And the Prophet ﷺ said, it's reported from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh, that the Prophet ﷺ cursed men that acted like or dressed like women, and women who acted like and dressed like men. Okay, so this is a Sahih hadith, very clear, multiple ahadith on this, and the fiqh is clear, everything is clear. But the thing is that this relationship between fiqh, the relationship between Islamic ethics and our politics, this is something that unfortunately the implications we haven't really worked out, or some amongst us haven't really worked it out. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rasulullah, is cursing something, this is something that we have to pay serious attention to. We have to take it very, very seriously. Why? And reflect if we don't understand, because in our culture, in this modern culture, there are many things that are very deeply wrong but have been normalized, and people are taking them for granted. And we have to be deeply concerned about our internal state. We have to be deeply concerned about what we view as right and wrong. Okay, because this is what the Prophet ﷺ has said very clearly in the hadith, and it's such an important hadith that Imam al-Nawawi has included it in his Arba'in, in his collection of 40 hadith. And so Imam al-Nawawi was specifically compiling 40 hadith that he considered, it's 42 hadith, but he was compiling them as being the essence of Islam. What is so important for Muslims to know from all the thousands of ahadith? What are the cream of the crop, the most important? And so he compiles these 42, and one of them is that the Prophet ﷺ said, none of you truly believes until his desires, his internal state, is aligned with or in accordance with what I have brought, meaning with Islam. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ has said. So this is, you don't have belief. Okay, we can't have belief just on the plain sense of the words of the Prophet ﷺ. You can't have belief if there's a misalignment. Okay, there's a misalignment between what you feel is right and wrong and what Allah has sent of Islam. Okay, for example, if you truly hate salah, if a person truly hates salah, then they can't be a believer, even if they are performing all of the 5 prayers, and even beyond the 5 prayers. They're doing supererogatory, mustahab prayers, sunnah prayers, nawafil prayers. They're doing the actions, but internally they hate it. Okay? Or, I was shocked to hear there was someone in the community that I was just talking to, and they were saying, Islam can be so difficult. For example, why are we required to make ghusl? Like, this was not just like an ignorant person, right? An ignorant Muslim. Like, they were practicing. They were coming to the masjid. And he was saying that, why do we have to make ghusl? This is something so useless after, being intimate with my spouse. This is ignorant. Like, I'm perfectly clean. I don't need to, perform ghusl. So this is something that, I didn't say anything. I was not going to, I didn't have that kind of relationship with a person to get into a debate with him on this. It was just in passing, like an acquaintance, that was just, it wasn't that kind of conversation. But that kind of statement, like, you have to check your iman, right? This is a kind of kufr statement to say something like that you are calling something that Allah has legislated, that Allah has commanded, you're calling it stupid, or you're saying that it's pointless. Like, you might not know, right? We might not know the purpose of something, or we might not know the wisdom of it. We might not know the illah of it, but that doesn't mean that we can say it's stupid or to say that we don't like it, or no, this is something that is gravely dangerous to one's iman to even have these thoughts. If you notice that if such a thought has crossed your mind, has crossed your heart, then that is a wake-up call. Right? That's a wake-up call. Like, oh, what am I thinking? So this is the danger when you live in a society that all of these things are normalized, and people are they're normal, they're celebrated. How does that affect our hearts? And it's a constant danger. It is a constant danger that one day you might wake up and suddenly something that Allah has prohibited or Allah has commanded, you don't like that, or you have this kind of hatred in your heart or a dislike for that in your heart. That is extremely, extremely dangerous for Muslims, and we have to check ourselves. This is completely beyond the political question, right? And we know the famous hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is telling us about if you do see something wrong, change it with your hand, and if you can't with your hand, change it with your tongue, speak out against it, and if not that, then at least hate it in your heart. And that's the lowest level of iman. So this is something that we have to always remember. But the thing is that we live in a society, like I mentioned, it's only been 5 or 10 years where this kind of morality has shifted, where suddenly before, if you polled people, the vast majority of people would say same-sex behavior is immoral. It's disgusting. It's terrible. Non-Muslims, Muslims, everyone was unanimous in this. It was only a small percentage of deviants who were actually promoting this kind of behavior. Then suddenly it was normalized through movies, through TV shows, through media, and in just the past 10 years. And then now the public opinion has shifted so dramatically, where that now the majority of people say, well, I can support same-sex marriage, or I don't think there's anything wrong with this. Okay, so why does that happen is one question. But then we also have to question, how is that affecting our hearts? Is that affecting how we're understanding the reality of things? So first, we have to get our hearts in the right place. We have to get our understanding in the right place on this issue. And that's what I'm primarily worried about. I think that if we're not careful, unfortunately, some Muslims will fall into, and some have already fallen into thinking that there's nothing wrong with this. This is nothing. And then they go back and try to reinterpret the ayat. They try to reinterpret hadith. They try to reform, quote unquote, Islam. So this is something that is extremely dangerous, and we have to be aware of it. So this question of, okay, so that's morality. And what I was going to say is that we live in a society where it's still fine. Like, people can criticize, especially from a religious basis. Like, our religion does not accept this. Our religion does not accept this. Like, why can't we say that? As a Muslim abiding by Islam, I cannot accept this kind of behavior of same-sex behavior or changing your gender. This is not something that I accept. So why can't Muslims say this in today's society? There's definitely room for that. It's allowed. Christians are saying it. Jews are saying it. Not all of them, but there is a sizable percentage of them that still maintain that and still speak of that. So why can't Muslims do that? We should be at the forefront of that, actually. We should be at the forefront of saying that this is something that's negative, harmful. We need to be opposed to it. 2016 was when same-sex marriage was legalized. 2016. So at that time, we had the opportunity. We have the opportunity to say that that same-sex marriage should not be legalized. It should absolutely not be legalized. And there were Supreme Court justices, unfortunately they weren't the majority, who were also saying that same-sex marriage is not something that the law should recognize. So why did Muslims like feel the need that we have to be on the leftist side of this issue? Why do we have to be on, and this tweet or this message from Ilhan supporting transgenders in the military? Hey, why does she feel the need to do that? There are plenty of Democrats who are socially conservative who didn't feel the need to like make a fuss and to make a big scene about this and make their policy position to be in support of transgenders in the military. Like, is this such a big constituency, right? Is this something? I'm saying, like, if you forget all about these other things I'm saying, if you forget about Islamic ethics, if you forget about practicality, forget about all this, at the end of the day, it's still like such a small group. And you can't tell me that, we have to defend the rights of these transgenders to be in the military. We have to, because if we don't support them to be able to fly fighter planes and to drive tanks, if we don't support them to fly drones, then they're going to come and take away Muslim rights. They're going to take away Muslim rights. How does that make any sense? How does that make any sense? Like, why how could those even be connected? Okay, there's so many different issues. There's so many different groups that are claiming rights, that are claiming that they, for example, the gun lobby, right? This is what some of these separatists, white nationalist separatists that are collecting all these kinds of assault rifles and weapons, and they're pro-gun, and they're flying their Confederate flags. They say, we have to have guns. The government can't take away these guns from us, because this is our Second Amendment right, and we have to be able to defend ourselves, and so on and so forth. They give all these arguments. And they say that if the government succeeds in taking away our guns, then that's just the first step toward totalitarianism. That's the first step towards eroding all of our rights, taking away all of our rights. This is a kind of slippery slope argument that gun rights lobbyists make. Okay, so this is the same kind of logic. If we don't, acknowledge the right of cross-dressing in the military for men to put on lipstick and a dress and be in the military, then suddenly everyone's religious rights are in danger. No, this is quite hyperbolic. This is quite hyperbolic. Is the sound quality, some people are saying, is too loud? Okay. Bara says, in my field, students have been kicked out for their discriminatory beliefs about LGBT patients. Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of intolerance. If you don't jump on the bandwagon, if you don't accept the LGBT dogma, then there's going to be consequences. And many of these platforms, social media platforms, are penalizing people who express any kind of negative view on LGBT. It's being considered to be a hate crime or hate speech. If you are going to say something like this is sinful, or this is immoral, this is harmful behavior, then even from a religious perspective, like, soon it's going to be illegal, I'm afraid, in some Western countries to even make a statement like that. Already within New York, this was also recent news, within New York, the New York legislature said that you can't, reparative therapy, so the kind of therapy, so this is psychotherapy, psychology, where there's a person attracted to the same sex, they consider themselves gay, and they want to get therapy so that they have, so they are attracted to the opposite sex. So this is something that has worked for a lot of people, but it's illegal now in New York for anyone to offer that. For anyone to offer that kind of therapy. They call it quote unquote conversion therapy. If you want to go from being homosexual to heterosexual. But this is something that has worked. I mean, there's many testimonies of people who feel... I've even met people who said that they used to have this kind of same-sex desire, but then they attended this kind of therapy, these programs that are offered. It's mostly offered in the Christian community, Jewish community as well, but they said that they've had success and they were able to get married and have children and be very happy and live according to their religious beliefs and be able to manage these kinds of same-sex desires, which is what we all do. We all have to manage our desires, and we all need help in managing shahwa. Okay, this is not something that is exclusive to same-sex desire individuals with same-sex desires. So anyway, we've talked a lot about LGBT. Yeah, there was another thing with Ilhan at a dance party for trans, which I thought was very disturbing. Let me see. Yeah. So she was just posting this, like, very... with no shame, right? This is a transgender man. They're giving him money. I don't know why. Yeah, this is a dance party for transgender. There's our congresswoman, mashallah, dancing with the man. So, disturbing stuff. Yeah, I'm just annoyed. Like, why do you have to do this? Like, do you not, like, does she not know what Islam has to say on this issue? That's a possibility, right? Could it be a possibility that she doesn't know that LGBTQ is, like, that kind of behavior, men dressing as women, that's something that is contrary to Islam? Like, even if... So, for example, if she took a purely practical perspective, which I don't think is right. I don't think it's right to take a practical perspective and say that, well, I personally believe that this kind of behavior is deeply, deeply harmful and destructive and causes all kinds of pain and suffering and harm. That's what I believe. But for practical purposes, I think we need to have, people should have the right to engage in that, and the government should protect that right. I don't think that that's coherent, first of all, for many reasons. But let's just imagine that it was coherent. Let's just concede that. Let's just imagine it is coherent. Let's concede that. If you have that kind of perspective, then why are you partying? Why are you celebrating and going, dancing around, embracing this kind of behavior and making and normalizing it? And this is what's so disturbing, that she's put on a pedestal as being this kind of role model for the Muslim community. Like, she is the golden girl, right? She's what the Muslim community has done. She's all that's right with the Muslim community. This is how some people conceive of it and portray it. Like, she's a role model for our young girls. Like, I don't want my daughters to be influenced by that, or to see her as a role model when she's doing these kinds of things. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. She's not a role model. This is just cultural. This is just Muslim as a political identity. Okay. And, disclaimer, I'm not saying that she's non-Muslim, etc. That's not for me to talk about in this instance. But as far as how we can understand it, like, how can you behave and speak in ways that are completely contrary to Islam and then claim to be, a Muslim representative or a representative of the Muslim community? The only way that makes sense is if being Muslim is just something cultural, Like you're born Muslim because your parents are from a Muslim country or you're from a Muslim country. It has nothing to do with beliefs. It has nothing to do with actual normative values, what you think is right and wrong. Being Muslim has nothing to do with that. Being Muslim is just concerned with, you're from an Arab or South Asian or Southeast Asian culture or an African culture. And it's your heritage. It's like what your parents used to do or used to think, and you're born into that. That's just a political identity. It's a cultural identity. And this is very harmful. Okay, it's very harmful because you can have, from this perspective, you can have a Muslim that doesn't believe in God. You can have a Muslim who is a mushrik and thinks that there is multiple gods that are worthy of worship. You can have a Muslim who, thinks the Quran is corrupted, or is obsolete, and be a Muslim because it's cultural. It has nothing to do with your beliefs and your values. That's not what being Muslim is about. Okay, being Muslim is just about being a political group, a political category. Just like we have LGBTQ, we have African American, we have Latino, Hispanic, and then we have Muslims. This is just different ethnicities. We have Jews. These are different ethnicities. So there's a danger that you're creating this kind of secularized political identity, and then Islam has no normative value, has no normative content, is not guiding people's behavior, is not guiding Muslims' behavior, it's not guiding how we're talking to people, how we're acting, how we're behaving. Shouldn't our religion have something to do with if a Muslim becomes wins an election and becomes a congressman or a senator or a prime minister or a mayor or whatever, shouldn't Islam have something to do with that Muslim's values, what that Muslim believes, what that Muslim thinks is right and wrong? Shouldn't there be some connection there between Islam and all of those things from that person? Of course there should be. Of course there should be. Only if you self-secularize, only if you say that, no, I'm leaving all of my beliefs, all of my values, everything that I think is right and wrong, I'm leaving it at the door of Congress. I'm not going to let it come in. I'm not going to let it come into the halls of government. Okay? No one does this. No one else does this, right? On no other issue. If you're a Christian or a Jew, right, look at all of the Christian and Jewish senators who go into the halls of government with certain ideas about Israel and about the Holy Land, about what they think is promised to the Jews. Okay, Christians and Jews have these certain evangelical Christians and Jews have these beliefs. Of course, they bring it to government. Of course, they bring it into how they are thinking about legislation. Of course, they're bringing those values and those beliefs, right? But Muslims, no. What we think is right and wrong, that has nothing to do with government. We have to not mix government and religion. There's separation of church and state. No, this is a wrong understanding. Or, for example, I mentioned the gun lobby. Or what about pro-choice, so-called pro-choice, meaning pro-abortion? That's a certain kind of belief about life, about agency, about these kinds of values of what's right and wrong. All of these kinds of values, they're not called religious, but they're still values. They're still normative beliefs, right? And so you have these kinds of pro-choice politicians coming into government with those normative values about right and wrong, the beginning of life, and so forth. And it's expected. It's taken for granted that's fine. Okay, but as soon as something is religious, no. We have separation of church and state. Those values are not allowed. But these other values, yes, we have to respect people's positions on abortion and the safety of guns in society, and redistribution of wealth, economics. All of these kinds of policies are based on beliefs and values that may not be considered religious, but they're still beliefs and values in the same vein that religious beliefs are. So what's the distinction? And I've written about this before and spoken about it when I talk about secularism, and we kind of analyze separation of church and state. This is actually one of the topics. I have an entire course dedicated to this coming up within alesna.org, which is the learning institute I recently launched. So this is going to be one of the big topics that we deconstruct, is separation of church and state and secularism and so forth. So this is what I find incoherent about some of these Muslim politicians that are so pro LGBT, and this is how they and they want the support of the Muslim community. Why should we support you? Like, when none of what you are advocating for is based on Islam at all. And you can say that I'm in this article that I wrote, I mentioned that one of the positive things is that they have stood by BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, against Israel. So BDS, so that's something good. I mean, Ilhan kind of waffled a little bit at first on that issue, but now her and Rashida have become more entrenched in this kind of BDS position, which I think is great. I think it's great, but that's like the minimum requirement. Like, that's the minimum requirement, I think, of, that's the kind of standard that I have for non-Muslims. Non-Muslims should be BDS. Like, that's the minimum level of being a moral human being. But if you're a Muslim, then that just means you haven't sold out. If you're pro BDS, that just means you haven't sold out, and that's good, but that's not nearly enough for me to think that, okay, you're actually representing Muslims and our values and our beliefs within government. Okay, so show me the Muslim politician who is actually going to stand by Islamic beliefs and is going to represent Islamic beliefs, and not kind of violate the very minimum aspects or the most basic aspects of the deen. Okay, show me that politician, and then I'll say, yeah, this is a good representative. This is a good representative of the Muslim community. Okay, show me that. But I mean, I'm very skeptical of that ever happening, because the secular system itself is designed to prevent such people from even advancing into the political sphere in the first place. I mean, that's just a reality. Like, if you have these kinds of views on your religion, on Islam, then you're not going to be able to climb those ranks and to win elections, and that's just the reality within the Western world. And that's why liberal secularism, even though it claims to be a neutral ground for all religions, is far from neutral. Far from neutral. There's no semblance of this ideal of religious freedom that is touted within the Western world. Okay. So, okay, any other questions? There's one more issue that I want to talk about. And that is on an article that I wrote. Let me share it on the screen 1 second. On this very gruesome, sad, disgusting case of this lesbian couple who starved a 2-year-old to death and basically neglected her to such an extent that she was malnourished. When police found her, there were thousands of lice in her scalp, and she was sick. and she died of starvation, and it was because of this lesbian couple. They're just abusing her. They're that abusive. Okay, and so this was extremely sad. What they did to this poor girl. Her name was Lauren. Here she is. So I pointed this out, this story, and basically went through, some of the details. Like, for example, police that arrested these lesbians said that they had no remorse. There was no guilt over what they did to this poor girl. Margaret Wade and Mary Sweeney showed no emotion as they were sentenced for neglecting the 2-year-old. Yeah, so they're monsters. Obviously, they're evil people for doing this. I mean, it's hard to even conceive like how people like this can exist. And really, these are the kinds of things that make we understand that the true justice in this world, in this universe, is coming from Allah in the Akhirah. Allah will truly mete out justice for people. Yeah. So this was extremely sad. But I was surprised. Like, when I posted this, the reaction that I got from people on the comments was bizarre. People were accusing me of being obsessed. And why am I pointing to women? And why am I caricaturing women? Am I a misogynist? Am I obsessed with these kinds of issues? I'm just focused on bad things done by women, etc., etc. So that was shocking. Like, you react to that kind of story, like this kind of sad, gruesome story, by thinking that just pointing it out or commenting on it is misogyny. Like, how does that make any sense? And specifically, I pointed out to this stat within the article itself that, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, approximately 40% of child victims of abuse were maltreated by their mothers acting alone, while only 18% of them were maltreated by their fathers acting alone. So this is a big gender discrepancy. It's a big gender discrepancy between men and women. Mothers are the ones who are, by and large, more likely to abuse their children. So child abuse is more so at the hands of mothers as opposed to fathers. So this, I think, is significant to understand and to point out. Why? Why is this significant? Why do I point these things out? Because every time I point out statistics like this, every time I note a case where a wife has abused her husband, has mistreated him, has treated him unjustly, every time that I get into one of these examples on my page on muslimskeptic.com, I get backlash. I get a lot of backlash from people who are inclined to feminism, or they might be white knights, and they find it offensive to even know about these kinds of cases. And they say, Daniel, you're a misogynist. You're just focusing on these issues. Why are you so biased against women? So I want to explain, like, what is the purpose? Like, why am I doing this? Why do I think it's important to point out these kinds of statistics? Why do I think it's important to point out these kinds of cases? The reason is that I'm trying to address the feminist argument. I'm trying to address the feminist argument that patriarchy is evil. Patriarchy is something that we should destroy. Patriarchy is something that has to be dismantled. This is what all feminists believe. To be a feminist, okay, so this is the argument that some people make when they're trying to defend feminism. They say, oh, there are so many different strands and so many different kinds of feminism. Like, there's no one feminism. There's just so many of them. So we can't critique and say we can't reject feminism out of hand because there's so many of them. This is kind of silly. Like, this is silly on its face. Like, no one says that about fascism. Oh, there are so many different kinds of fascism. You can't like reject fascism because there's just a diversity of fascist views. So it's pointless to try to critique him. No one says that about fascism. But feminism gets a free pass because of this kind of excuse. It doesn't make sense. But besides that, there is a core to feminism. There is an essence to feminist thought that's shared amongst all feminists that makes them feminists. And it's this opposition to the patriarchy, that men have this kind of influence where they want to subjugate women for their own interests. So this is subjugation and oppression by men against women. And so this is what patriarchy. When I use the word patriarchy, Islam is a patriarchal religion. Islam is a patriarchal religion. All traditional religions are patriarchal, and all societies of history have been patriarchal. What do I mean by this? What do I mean by patriarchal? I mean that men were seen as the authority. Men were the authorities within these societies. Men were the leaders of these societies. Okay? When there's a hierarchy of authority and men are at the top of that's patriarchy. Okay? And this is very clear in the Quran. الرجال قوامون على النساء. Men are قوامون على النساء. Over. على means over. And qawamun, it means to be an authority, to lead. It has connotations of protecting. Okay, if this is the way that some people translate it, like, oh, it just means protection. It doesn't mean authority. Okay, to protect someone, you have to have power where they are weak, right? If I'm protecting my child, I can protect my child because I'm stronger. I have more power than my child. That's why I protect my child. My child is not protecting me. So some people will translate الرجال قوامون على النساء as men are protectors over women. And they think that this kind of avoids the problem of saying men are authorities over women. But it's silly, because to protect, as I'm saying, if women were authorities or women were powerful, more powerful than men, then women would be protecting men. It would make no sense for Allah to say that men are protectors of women if women are more powerful or are able to protect themselves. Right? So this is very clear. This is explicit in the Quran. It's also explicit when we look at the seerah. It's explicit when we see fiqh. When we look at fiqh, it's explicit all over Islam. There's no denying it, that Islam is patriarchal in this sense. But the distinction between that Islamic patriarchy and the feminist notion of patriarchy is that the feminist notion says that kind of authority that men have is evil. That kind of authority that men have is immoral, because men are subjugating and oppressing women. And we reject this. We can reject this. Okay? Just because someone is an authority does not mean that they're oppressors. Just because someone has power, it doesn't mean that they're oppressing, that they're subjugating, that they're taking advantage for your own benefit and for your own interests, for their own interests. Okay? We reject that move. We reject that logic. Right? So this is very, very important. We have to understand Islam is a patriarchal religion. Okay, in this sense of patriarchy, as we've defined it in terms of the Quran and the Sunnah and the scholarly tradition itself. We've defined it according to our terms. We're not just blindly adopting a foreign term without, naively adopting that. No, we define it in our own terms. And then we make this distinction between that kind of feminism, or that kind of patriarchy, and the patriarchy that is found in that kind of patriarchy that is decried in feminism, and the patriarchy that actually exists within Islam. So it's very important to make sure that we understand that distinction. So what the feminists will argue is that no, men being in charge is inherently evil. Why? Because look at how much men abuse women. And that's where they'll cite statistics. They'll say, well, look at domestic abuse, look at rape, look at all of these instances, look at the wage gap, look at all of these things where men are taking advantage of women. And so this is showing us, this proves that the patriarchy is evil and that it must be dismantled, and it's hindering equality, it's hindering justice and equitable society and so forth. So this is the argument that they make. They start with the stats, they start with the statistics, and then they come to the conclusion that patriarchy is evil and that therefore it needs to be dismantled. Okay, well then one way to argue against this kind of reasoning is to say, well, look at these stats that show how women take advantage of men. Look at these statistics that show how women are committing violence, oppression, subjugation, such as in the case of child abuse, such as in the case of even domestic abuse. Like there is one researcher and professor of the University of New Hampshire, I believe. His name is Murray Strauss. He passed away recently, but Dr. Strauss has this kind of meta study where he looked at over 200 different studies of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And when he looked at 200 studies, he concluded that there's parity, there's equality, that women are very often the perpetrators just as much as men when it comes to domestic violence. Here, let me pull up the paper for you so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And this is something that maybe one day we'll talk about in depth. Now I have to share the screen. Okay. Yeah, so he makes an even bolder claim. He says that there's been years of denying the evidence on gender symmetry in partner violence. Right? He's saying there's symmetry in terms of men as the perpetrator of violence against women versus women as the perpetrator of violence against men. This is something that he's arguing based on his research of 30 years of study on this issue. So he says there are 200 studies that he's looked at and summarized, that this kind of reality, this symmetry, is being swept under the rug and is being ignored. Okay, so what is the purpose of understanding statistics like this? I am concerned. So some people might say, Daniel, you're just a men's rights activist. You think that there's women's rights, so you're just the opposite. You're just the feminists are bad because they're man haters, and you're bad because you're a woman hater. You're just the mirror image of these feminists, so you're just as bad. I mean, this is what some people will say against me. They'll say, "Oh, fine, feminism is one extreme. Well, you're the other extreme. You're just as wrong as they are. So, you're a hypocrite for criticizing them." No. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not trying to say that we need men's rights or we need to, have a men's rights movement, meninists or anything like that. No, the idea here is look at the argument that we started with, right? You take statistics about men being violent, men being abusive, and then you conclude that there is this evil patriarchy and that men are subjugating women on a systematic, structured, structural patriarchy, a structural injustice. So this is the kind of move that's made. Okay, so then what if we look at the statistics showing that women are cause of oppression? There are women who cause this, who have a tendency towards violence in these circumstances. Should we then conclude that there's an evil matriarchy? That there's an evil matriarchy that's subjugating all men? Should we come to that conclusion? No, that's absurd. We would say that that's ridiculous. Obviously, there's not a matriarchy. So this shows that the initial argument is invalid, that it's absurd as well. This is argument ad absurdum in logic or in rhetoric. This is something that you learn if you take a logic class or you take a debate class, you're trained in debate. You just parallel the argument, you mirror it, you parrot it, you parody it, and then it shows that how illogical and invalid the original argument is. Okay, that's the point. That's the point. So all of these feminists who will go and rant, yeah, of course, there are dirtbag husbands, there are dirtbag fathers, there are many terrible, unjust, violent, abusive, oppressive men. Of course, no doubt. Okay, but the question is, the problem is the feminist makes the move to take that instance or to take that statistic and then draw the much larger conclusion that there is an evil patriarchy that must be dismantled and so forth. And patriarchy itself is inherently bad. But this is a wrong move because it's an invalid move because we can point to evil women, dirtbag women, violent women, abusive women, oppressive women. Okay? We can point to those examples as well, and that's what I try to do for the purpose of this larger argument. Okay? There are also evil women. 40% of child abuse is done by the mother acting alone. 40%. So the vast majority of child abusers are women. Does that mean that there's an evil matriarchy? Does that mean that we have to have a meninist movement, a men's rights movement, that we have to fight motherhood, that we have to fight the institution of motherhood, that we need to free children, that we need to, make sure that the government is taking control of everyone's child and put restrictions on parenting and so forth that makes sure that no child gets ever abused again? And this is what feminists will argue when it comes to marriage. They'll say that marriage is inherently a destructive, evil, oppressive institution and that we need to dismantle marriage. You have a lot of second wave feminists who said this. A lot of second wave feminists said that heterosexual marriage is inherently oppressive, and they said that the only non-oppressive marriage is a lesbian marriage. And that's why many second wave feminists chose to be lesbians because of this. One of them, Shilamuth Firestone, it's a weird name, but she is the one who probably argued in the most depth about how marriage needs to be dismantled. Heterosexual marriage is something inherently evil and destructive because of the patriarchy. It's inherently rape. All heterosexual sex is rape because there's a power differential between men and women. And so even if a woman says that, oh yeah, I consent to having sex, it's because she's brainwashed by the patriarchy. And that's still rape, because if you're brainwashed, if you're not in your own right mind, you're suffering from false consciousness, then even if you consent to doing something, it's against your will, against your interests, and therefore it's harmful, and therefore it's rape. So these are the kinds of arguments that feminists will make, and that kind of mentality, even though not as extreme, is found in all strains of feminist thought. So this is the argument that I try to put forth, and it's very important to note all of these statistics and all of these examples, because what's at stake, right? Dismantling the patriarchy. All of Islam, we talked about how Islam is patriarchal, and how that kind of patriarchy is recognized in the Quran, is legislated in the Quran, it's legislated in Hadith, in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is canonized and established within the fiqh, within the jurisprudence and the ethics of Islam for 1400 years. So if you're going to dismantle the patriarchy, it means you're going to dismantle Islam. That's the long and the short of it. This is why it's so dangerous. This is why feminism is so dangerous and so harmful. And I just continue to be shocked by Muslims who don't understand what's at stake with this issue, and they want to say that, oh, I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed. You have Muslims that are leaving, who are becoming disillusioned with Islam. They're leaving Islam because of feminism, because they've been taught these feminist ideals, and this idea that patriarchy is evil, and then they read the Quran, and then they read the Sirah, or then they hear, they go and learn fiqh. They go to some of these institutions of Islamic learning, and they want to be tullab al-ilm, and then they read about the fiqh, and it completely contradicts feminist thought. It completely contradicts this idea of patriarchy as evil, and they're disillusioned by that. They're shocked. They go through a culture shock, and then some of them end up leaving Islam, and we ask Allah to save us from that, Ya Rab, and our families. Okay. Yeah, so here's a question from a brother Hassan. People are more likely to oppress when they're in a position to do so. A leader is more likely to oppress public. A husband is more likely to oppress his wife. A mother is more likely to oppress her kids. It's not because of gender, but power dynamics. Is that not correct? Yeah, so of course, when you have power over someone, then that is, you have the opportunity to oppress them. You have the opportunity to abuse them and take advantage of your position. No doubt about it. But does that mean that we have to dissolve all power? Does that mean we have to dissolve all kind of authority? No, that doesn't make any sense. So, for example, a police force. A police officer has authority and has power over people. And can that police officer abuse people and take advantage of his position of power? Of course, it's happening. It happens very often, unfortunately. But does that mean that we have to dissolve and dismantle the police force, and we should just not have any kind of police? Is that the conclusion that we would take from that? No, absolutely not. That makes no sense. No one says that we have to abolish police. Police serve a very important purpose. They protect. They keep things ordered. They keep things in a way that can be functional. Without police, there would be chaos. There'd be so much destruction, so many violations of people's rights, death, and harm. Same thing with all kinds of authority. When it comes to the authority of the husband, when it comes to the authority of the mother for her children, and so forth. And this is when the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith, "Kullukum ra'in," all of you are shepherds. This is what the Prophet ﷺ has said. "Kullukum ra'in," all of you are shepherds, because you all have your spheres of authority, and you're responsible for the people that are in your trust. You are charged with protecting and guiding and helping your circle of influence. If you're a husband, that's your family. If you're a mother, that's your children. Right? If you're a leader, that's your community, that's your people. So ultimately, everyone is accountable to Allah. Okay? Allah is the ultimate authority. And so everyone who is in authority has to fear Allah. Everyone who is in authority has to fear Allah. Okay, so let's see. There was one other issue that I wanted to talk about, but I'm running out of time. Oh, I didn't talk about all male panels. Why all male panels are great. Okay, so this I think we have to save for next week, because it's going to take me a long time to address this issue properly and give all the right examples. So, I mean, I'm not saying this in tongue-in-cheek that all male panels are great. If you want to read the article that I wrote on this, you can go to muslimskeptic.com and see that. But I want to elaborate and respond to some of the objections that people had to that. There's this movement that no all male panels, hashtag no all male panels, hashtag don't forget her. This has been going on for a few years now. And we're going to boycott any kind of panel that has all men. And if you go to conferences like ISNA and ICNA as well, I think. I'm not sure about ICNA, but ISNA convention, they make sure that there's no all male panels. There has to be, a female present, a female body on that panel. So this is very strange. It's contrary to Islamic ethics. So we need to analyze this, and we need to understand why feminism is contorting our brains, right? Contorting our minds, and so that this makes sense to us or to some of us, and it like has value for some of us. So we need to analyze that and break that down. I don't have time to do it because it's almost 2 hours, mashallah. So thank you to those who have watched the whole thing. Okay, yeah. So next week, inshallah, I think that we might do a different time, like an earlier time. So the brothers and sisters in the UK, if they want to watch live and ask questions, they have the opportunity to do so, and also in Asia as well, inshallah. So I'll announce the new timing for next week. But when I announce it, feel free to ask questions in the comments if you can't attend live, and then I'll answer the questions hopefully within the broadcast. And this is also going to be recorded. I'll put it up on Facebook. It'll also be available on YouTube, inshallah. And MuslimSkeptic.com, there's going to be new articles. I try to do it daily. If there's something that happens, it might not be daily, but follow MuslimSkeptic.com. And also, if you want to learn about these issues more deeply, critiques of modernism, progressivism, classes on atheism, liberalism, secularism, LGBT, all of these issues, we're addressing that. There's pre-recorded classes that take you step by step so you can understand the philosophy at a deep level and address these issues at the new learning institute that I founded with my wife, called Alesna Institute. And you can go to the site and sign up and enroll at alesna.org. So if you're interested in these issues and want to address them, then please do that, inshallah. Okay, that's all for today. Jazakumullahu khairan. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.